Hello and welcome to another edition of Another Book Review. This week I'll be reviewing Addicted to Reform by John Merrow. Unfortunately, I read this on ebook, so I don't have a cover to share with you, but I will talk briefly about the author, go into what the book is about, what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, who I recommend the book to, and finish off with what I will be reading for next time. John Merrow was a reporter with both PBS and NPR. I think he reported for about 40 years, mostly on the education beat. He was also a school teacher for a couple years, and he now, I think, works for a nonprofit in the education space. Addicted to Reform is really his look at the current K-12 education system. This book came out in 2017, right after the Trump election, and it really focuses on what he sees as the failures of both No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top in terms of the federal standards related to teacher evaluation and testing, and how those impact K-12 children, and what he would propose to, how he would propose to kind of fix that system through a fairly significant paradigm shift. So I will say, whenever you get a book where someone is talking about upending an entire system, especially one this size, which affects millions of students, I do appreciate the big ideas. And he does come with some pretty big ideas. He talks about eliminating the senior year of high school in preference for having a year of preschool. And he also talks about sorting children less by their age and more of their ability. The book contains really different parts of the education system and kind of different things that really add to its failings. One of them is a chapter on ADHD and how that's become more and more prevalent in K-12 children, which I thought was interesting. He also has a pretty large section on charter schools and how he thinks privately run charter schools, he has a very low opinion of them. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the con section, but he does have some pretty interesting insight as to some of the financial intransparent, opaque nature of the finances of the charter school, the companies that run the charter schools. And so I thought that was interesting. I think on the negative side and the things that I kind of struggled with, off the bat, I kind of realized that John and I were kind of coming at it from different directions. I think he kind of talks about, he uses the opening kind of uses the Trump election to kind of point out how very few people as a population voted in the 2016 election, and that how he thinks that the number one goal of schools is to make strong citizens. I personally believe that the goal of education is to build the strengths of the student and give the student the freedom and the autonomy to kind of do whatever it is they want to do. I think citizenship, while important, I definitely believe that people should have the right to participate at whatever level they particularly choose to do, unless, again, it's kind of a mandatory thing, but that's a personal preference. So I kind of knew from there we would maybe be on opposite sides of the fence on a lot of these issues, and it turns out that we were. But putting that aside, the other problems I had with the book, there's sections along with kind of the essay-like writing he does, where he kind of pulls a lot of references from other articles and publications. He has sections of the book called In My Life, which is where he kind of uses his own personal life and his history in teaching and his history of reporting and kind of building out some of those, kind of give you some of those stories that he ran in kind of his time as a reporter. I really didn't need any of that, and I felt that space could have been better used, because my main problem with the book is I feel like while I think he has some strong ideas that are interesting, he doesn't go the extra step of telling you how this would work concretely. I think the big one is two big ones. The two main, I think, focuses that he has is that we test students too often. Again, this is K-12 students, so we test students too often, and then we use those test scores to evaluate teachers. And he says we shouldn't do that. What he kind of proposes, the system he kind of proposes to replace that would be one where instead of asking how intelligent is this child, we ask how is this child intelligent. And so instead of sorting children kind of into by age, they're tracking students, and kind of by a pretty relatively young age, students kind of get a sense of whether or not they're winners or losers in the school. I had no real opinion of that. I don't really know how prevalent that attitude is in schools, or how children react to that if that's what they think is true. The problem I have with the idea of having that question flipped as far as how is this child intelligent? So we acknowledge that the child is intelligent, but how are they intelligent? The problem with that to me was, well, what does that test look like? And is that a panel? Is that similar to something like the military has something called an ASVAB, which basically measures your intelligence across several different sectors? When do you give that to the child? Once you know how they are intelligent, how does that change what most people recognize as the academic baseline of schools, which are how do you learn how to read and write and work with math? And so my frustration with that was he didn't seem to want to go the extra mile to actually answer those questions. And so instead of what I was hoping he would do is something similar to what David Brooks does in The Social Animal and in maybe other books, is he kind of lays out his theory and then has like a fictional character kind of walk through the book with you to kind of, for him to apply these things to the character, so you see really quickly what exactly this thing would look like in a real person's life. And I think that is missing really hard from this book, because I think I could get on board with some of the things he talks about as far as removing the 12th grade. If you argue with people that it's not as useful and that students, if they're academically inclined, could use that for dual enrollment if they wanted to, even though I did that in my high school and I know other people did as well. So I don't know how big of a change or what that looks like, and give that year instead to preschoolers. I think there's a lot of people who would see merit in that. When you get to some of these other things that are probably more radical as far as sorting children by ability and sorting children, he wouldn't call sorting children, but having the acknowledgement that each child has different strengths. Again, I think that sounds wonderful in theory, but what would that look like? And is there an objective way to do that? And is your problem that there are objective tests that you question the validity of the test? And do you think it should be a subjective thing? And then how do you get into biases, and what happens if a student disagrees with the teacher's assessment, and kind of all of those things. And I think that's the beauty of standardized tests, in my opinion, is that they are given to everybody without anybody knowing you. So this teacher doesn't know me, and he would probably view that as a bad thing. I view that as a good thing, because you're just measured on what the test is. You either know it or you don't know it. And, here's your number. You did well, you didn't do well. Hopefully you'll do better next time, but here's the area where you could improve. So I thought that those things, I think the book overall could have gone deeper and could have been written in a way to where you really saw the application of what he was talking about, instead of just kind of idea. So he'll say things like, and I think that the school should be small enough to where every principal knows a child's name. And you're like, well, that school would need to be about 150 students, so you would be calling for the opening of many, many more schools, or you'd have some kind of other idea to make it so we're talking about really, really relatively small groups of people. And because he doesn't have that, I don't know if there's a literary term for it, but it basically doesn't have the scenario where this is what I'm talking about, this is what it will look like for that child. The other thing that I found kind of, again, probably good in theory but poor in practice, was expanding how children are evaluated. Excuse me. So instead of just basically having maybe 5 subjects, or if you have something like an FCAT where you have the FCAT score, or Texas Stars, whatever it is, and just basically here's your score, you would have something where children are evaluated. He doesn't, again, say how they would do it, but evaluated on something like truthfulness or trustworthiness or health. And I just see that going so poorly so quickly. And I mean, I just think of it like, would you tell an 8-year-old's parents that they're untrustworthy? And how would you measure trustworthiness? How would you measure honesty? And so some of the things I think sound good from, again, if what you're going for is citizenship, and I think most people would argue, again, I shouldn't say most people, I would argue that's not, the school really should be maybe a secondary or tertiary concern, in my opinion. And so not really basic ability. then it's going to be and I don't know how you get everybody on board with that, first of all, but second of all, I don't know how you actually have a test to show those things. The beauty of standardized tests are you print them out, you give them to people, and that's it, and they're relatively inexpensive. He feels that isn't really the way to go about it. I think he kind of points to another problem that I had with it when he kind of talks about in the beginning where America ranks, which is relatively in the middle as far as standardized countries, developed countries were in the middle of the rankings. It doesn't really sell to me why that's a crisis. So I think the whole book wants you to kind of come in with, oh, this is a crisis. And he kind of has a structure of talking about it's in the form of a 12-step program. And the first step is admitting you have a problem. That whole chapter didn't really sell me on this is a crisis and we all need to get and fix this thing. And then he calls, a couple times throughout the book, he calls people cheap for not wanting to put up the money for things. He doesn't give us a price tag to say, in this perfect world, in my dream world, if I was the creator of all these things and I can wave a magic wand and make it happen, it would cost X dollars per state or X dollars per student. This is what it costs now, and this is what it would cost. He doesn't do that. And so when he calls people cheap for not wanting to put up the money, you're like, well, we spend more than any other country in the world on education. I think we're fourth on K through 12 education, but if you count college, I think we're first in the world by some margin. So cheap, not fair, but hey, that's his opinion. And I think from his viewpoint, we probably should be spending more on education. And from my standpoint, I think for a lot of people, the root of the problem it has not been discovered. And I think the frustration of this book is that the blame is not quite clear. I think a lot of people would want to put the blame on the feet of the teacher because they don't want to blame the student, and they would have to have some self-analysis if they blamed the parents. So it really ultimately goes on to the teacher. He kind of, again, wants to stay away from testing as evaluation of the teacher, but how he would evaluate the teacher fairly is kind of not quite clear either. He pretty strongly believes that the teacher is integral to learning, which to me means if you believe that's true, then they could have either a really positive effect or a really negative effect on a student. And I guess from my perspective, wouldn't you want to have a system where you could remove poor teachers? And what he's kind of proposed doesn't quite make a lot of sense to me. He's kind of noted that there are a lot of, I don't think he wants to say bad teachers, but there's a lot of churn in this system. The teacher pay is low, and we should have more educated teachers. But he doesn't, again, have like concrete steps to bring more teachers in as far as putting up numbers so you can actually have a plan. So I think that it was more of a lot of ideas. Like this would be a good idea, this would be a good idea, this would be a good idea. But there's not a lot tying all those ideas together. And then finally, the other thing that he does that irked me, he kind of blanketly is against charter schools. And while I haven't done a deep research into it, everywhere I've seen, and I think he even acknowledges this in the book, is that charter schools have kind of a mixed record. So sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. And he's pretty strongly against them, and what seems to be the only reason is because there are people who may make money from the school. And you're like, well, if there's 5 schools in a neighborhood, they're all failing, and a 6th school that's a charter school comes in and is doing better, isn't that a positive thing no matter if someone who set it that school makes money? It just seems like kind of a strange thing to be upset about, and then not be upset about bad teachers and how to remove the teachers, because the charter schools make up roughly like 6% of the students. And he has a fairly long chapter on charter schools and why he seems really dead set against them. So I had some issues with it. I thought from an idea standpoint, if you wanted to look at different ideas that could be generated to improve the system, I think he definitely has them. I wish they had all felt more organic and real and tied together than they were. I think he has a chapter on cyberbullying that I thought was interesting, even though I think his solution to that problem just didn't make a lot of sense to me. So that was Addicted to Reform by John Merrow. Next time I'm going to finish up The Monkey Wrench Gang. Until next time, please feel free to like the video, subscribe to the channel. I'll leave my Twitter link in the section below. Until next time, bye.